Well, it's good to have those of us who have been traveling back with us. And we missed the big crowds we've had the last couple of weeks, though. But we do appreciate the fact that everyone is here. And today I want to approach this in a little bit different method or a different approach than what perhaps you're accustomed to. Today is what's called Palm Sunday in the ecclesiastical calendar. And I want to talk some about what that is. And if you notice that the title of your handout is the Monday of the last week, and that was wrong. I typed that in wrong. I got it right in my notes, but that's wrong because I want to talk about the Sunday of the last week. And but the passages are all the ones that match up. And most of you are aware that this is the period or the season of the year when there's a lot of talk about Jesus and his resurrection, namely speaking of Easter. And we've talked about enough about the origin of Easter in the past, so all of you, I'm sure, understand about it. So what my intention is that I'm going to approach this as the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry. The next Sunday that will appear in his life will be the one in which he was raised. So during the next few weeks, Lord willing, we're going to go as much as possible day by day through the events that took place in the last week that Jesus was here. And in addition to that, I want to bring in some of the material that will help you to understand something about what the world was like when Jesus came here. Most of us don't really understand very much about it. We've heard the Bible stories and all that, and we've more or less come to the conclusion that the only thing going on in the world was just what was happening in Palestine. But that was far from the case. The world was going on about its thing. There were all kinds of other activities that were going on. But particularly today, what I want to talk about is something of the Jewish political and social structure. And I think you'll find that it's somewhat different than what you might have anticipated that it was. The Jewish system, of course, was primarily based on the synagogue at this particular time. Of course, the temple was in existence, and that was where the individuals had to go for the various feasts that took place. But the synagogue was the primary place of worship for them because it was just virtually impossible for everybody to get to the temple every week to have their assemblies. So consequently, as a result of the separation or the captivity that took place by the Babylonians, the synagogue had been developed, and there's no instruction in the scripture whatsoever for the synagogue. But it's evident that Christ accepted it and God accepted it. In fact, it's important for us to understand about the synagogue because basically we operate like the synagogue did to a certain degree. Our organization and all that is very similar to it. But nevertheless, as we look at this, it was the civic and political and you might say social center of the Jewish community. You got together at the synagogue, and that was where you took care of all of these situations. It had a man who was designated as the ruler of the synagogue. He was basically the chief as far as it was concerned, though he didn't have all of the say about what was going on. There was a second individual called the attendant, and his responsibility was all of the, you might say, the paperwork type things that had to be done, plus the teaching of children. And I don't think anyone basically gave a whole lot of thought to how did the kids get their education. Well, they went to the synagogue, and the attendant taught them using the scrolls of the Torah, the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That was their school books, and that was how they learned. And so you have these two individuals, and in addition to them, there were 3 elders. The elders had the basic responsibility, we'll call it, of law and order in the community. because there was no police force. And so the three elders basically determined what was right and wrong and what kind of punishment and all of that could take place. And what we can do, if you like, is we'll take a look at our scriptures here. The first one that we could have read was from 2 John 22, talking about the same thing that basically that was read to you earlier, so I'm going to leave that for you to read. But in Acts 22:19, I said, Lord, people not here know that I went from synagogue to synagogue to imprison and whip those who believe in you. This is the Apostle Paul speaking. The elders in the synagogue had the authority to beat and whip or flog members of the community that did not obey the commands of the law or whatever else was necessary for them to have an orderly life. Like I said, they were basically the law enforcement part of the Jewish community. I don't think most of you ever realized that was the case, but the elders had that responsibility, and they could have individuals beaten or flogged as the case might demand. And in addition to that, they could put you out of the synagogue, and this is looking at John 9:22. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. The Jews had already agreed to put anyone out who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ out of the synagogue. Well, if you went out of the synagogue, you were separated from the community. You were excommunicated is the word that's used in some instances, because you have no place to worship. You have no association, you might say, with family or friends or anything like that. You are separated from the community. You are excommunicated. And you have no political status at all either. So this is the authority that was within the synagogue itself. And the three elders that were there, basically, I guess you probably have the five individuals that we've named, but these would be the ones that would make these kind of decisions. And so the synagogue had a lot of authority and was basically the operating religious body as far as the church was, or the community of the Israelites was concerned at the time. And you can see, though the church in a way is organized along similar lines, we don't usually flog people or excommunicate them. But nevertheless, but if you read the scriptures, you'll see that authority, other than the flogging, was given to the church as well to excommunicate. But at any rate, looking at these things and thinking about them. But then the next organization we'll take a quick look at was the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was composed of 71 members. The 71 members were primarily the ones of the chief priest and the high priest. But in addition to that, part of the members were Pharisees and the scribes. Most of the scribes were Pharisees. The scribes were the lawyers of that particular time. They were the individuals who were expert in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They knew and understood these things, and it was their responsibility to see that these things were carried out in the way in which they were intended to be. The elders that were part of the Sanhedrin were the actual, you might call, they were referred to as the lay nobility. The Sanhedrin was composed primarily of the wealthy people. The Sadducees, who were the leaders as far as the main part of the priest was concerned, and the high priest, these were individuals that did not believe in a resurrection. They did not believe in a second life or anything like this. They were basically what was known as Hellenists. They had adopted the Greek view on life. And so as a result of this, these individuals only lasted until the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. After that, there were no more Sadducees, so apparently they perished with the city of Jerusalem. But at any rate, all of these were individuals that took place, but probably something that you didn't know. You've probably heard of the Sanhedrin, but in Jerusalem there was the one which was considered the Supreme Court and the legislative body as far as the Jews were concerned. It made the final decisions on the law and things of this nature. But it had only authority based on what the Romans permitted it to have. And the Romans, though, their viewpoint on it was, as long as it involved Jews, they didn't really care particularly what they did. And their authority was supposed to be just for Jerusalem, but they were able to reach out, just as they authorized Paul to go to Damascus to take individuals, imprison them even, and punish them. So they had a sort of a legal approach that they could take too. But in addition to that, there were two more Sanhedrins in Jerusalem, both composed of 21 members. And these were, you might say, sort of lower courts that individuals would go to and then would ultimately be referred to the Supreme Court, much like our system works. So these were just some of the situations and the circumstances that existed at the time when Jesus comes into the picture. And next time I want to talk some about the social structure. It would probably surprise you there, a number of the things that are involved in the social structure of the Jews. But at this point, I want us to look at Sunday and what it was like. In Zechariah, the 9th chapter and the 9th verse, behold, rejoice with all your heart, people of Zion, shout in triumph, people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious. He is humble and rides on a donkey, on a colt, a young pack animal. Now this, of course, is the prophecy that was made several hundred years before Christ, and the prophecy about him coming. And Jesus, in his coming in this last week, one of the principal things that he's doing during the last week of his life is fulfilling the prophecies that were made about him. And he goes at great length to do that. Now in Matthew 21, verses 1 to 5, now when they drew near Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, at the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and immediately he will send them. All this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, tell the daughters of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. So the prophecy was made specifically, and exactly what they're saying is what Jesus did. In the succeeding verses to this, once they had gotten the donkey, they brought it to Jesus. And the significance of a donkey is that kings rode donkeys. They didn't ride horses, they rode donkeys. That was the animal that was used for their transport. So for Jesus to appear riding on a donkey was the demonstration of the fact that he was a king. And for a saddle, the next couple of verses there in 21 tell you that they took their coats and they put them on the donkey, and then Jesus got on him and rode into the city. So this was Sunday morning. He had spent the night in Bethany with Lazarus and his family, whom he had raised from the dead. And so now he is going into Jerusalem, and beginning in verse 8 and 9 here in Matthew 21, and a very great multitude spread their clothes on the road. Others cut down branches from the trees and spread them on the road. Then the multitudes who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. So this is where the name for this particular Sunday, Palm Sunday, comes from, because in some versions you have it translated that they could cut palm branches and put them in the road in front of Jesus as he rode in. This again was another symbol of greeting a king when he was coming into a town. They would put palm branches and all in the road ahead of him, and he would come in riding on his donkey. We don't really get too involved with that idea, I guess, about riding on a donkey being a particularly way for a king to appear, but in their society, that was the way in which it happened. The recognition, of course, that took place here was that the people were recognizing him and the things that they were saying about him, that he was the Son of David, that he was Lord, and that he was of the highest. All of these are terms that were used for kings. And since he was the Son of David, that would make him a king in that line. And Lord, all of these were things that were being said about him, and the things that were creating a problem as far as some was concerned. But of course there was a lot of turmoil in the city of Jerusalem, and verses 10 and 11 tell us, and when he had come into Jerusalem, all the city was moved, saying, "Who is this?" So the multitude said, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee." So they recognized who Jesus was. The people had been talking about him in the way that they had been. And part of what he gets involved in then, when he gets there, is the process of cleansing the temple. This is one of his first actions, and everything basically that Jesus does during this week is stuff that will irritate and agitate the powers that be. In Matthew 20, let me get back here to go to Luke, the 45th verse and 46th verse. Then he went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in it, saying to them, "It is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." There are some other passages, and as I have promised you in the past, we want to read about that together. You'll go to the 11th chapter of John here. Well, in the 11th chapter of the, well, if I get to the 11th chapter, I'll be where I'm supposed to be. Wondered why it was the same reading I already had. Starting in the 13th verse. So they came to Jerusalem when Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying, It is not written, is it not written, my house is to be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves. And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teachings. That's in the 11th chapter of John, beginning in verse 13. So the actions that Jesus was taking were ones that were alienating him as far as the people themselves, or the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees were concerned, the leaders as far as in the temple. They were very much concerned with him. And in Matthew 21, verses 10 and 11, or Matthew 21:12, then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold their wares. You notice that there is a great similarity between the passages in the different versions. There's also, this is spoken of by John, and so the Gospels all basically carry this same story. And one particular one, they mention the fact that he even made a whip out of cords and drove them out of the temple. So this was not something that was intended to endear him to the powers that be and the people that were there. In Matthew 21:14, then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. So after he had cleansed the temple, after he had driven out the money changers and the people that were operating the concessions there, and this is a point we've made before, but you need to be aware of that, is the fact that basically what was happening was the chief priest and the Sadducees, this is how they made money. They had individuals come in and basically run concessions in the temple. So you didn't have to go out and find you a lamb or a dove or whatever it was that you need to offer for a sacrifice, you could just stop by the temple and pick one out. They had them right there already available for you. All you had to do was buy one. And I'm sure the price was adjusted to accommodate you, sort of a 7-Eleven type approach of picking up whatever you needed for your sacrifice. And also, in addition to that, a certain type of money was required for use in the temple. They had a particular coinage that they used in the temple, and you had to have that particular type of money in order to pay for redeeming a child, or to provide whatever money was necessary for buying the animals or anything of this nature. You had to exchange your money, and of course, anytime you exchange money, you always have to pay a price for the exchange. So the scribes, Pharisees, and the Sadducees had a real money-making deal going here, and Jesus comes in and he turns the tables over and drives the animals and the people out. And he wouldn't, as we just read, he wouldn't let them take anything with them. They had to leave it behind when they went out. So I'm sure that it got confiscated. So they lost their money and the business that they had. So all of this was stuff that would really endear him to the individuals that were in the temple. After he had healed these individuals, he was healing the lame and the blind and all of this that were in the temple. In Matthew 21:15, but when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And so between a combination of Jesus destroying their income, healing these individuals that were ill, and getting the praise of the people and the acceptance by them, everything that was happening were things that would be upsetting to the people that were in charge. And so they are indignant. And as we read from John, at this particular point, they plan to kill him. Now, which of course is almost unbelievable, that the people that are responsible for law and order and for maintaining the legal system and the society are now planning to kill an individual who isn't doing anything but good. But nevertheless, that was their plan. And of course, if you read on, you discover that Jesus was not the only one that they planned to kill. They planned to kill Lazarus too, because basically if Lazarus was raised from the dead, that proved Jesus had that power, so they wanted to kill him as well. Again, something that really doesn't make any sense. But at this particular point, Jesus has made enough friends for the day, and so 21:17 tells us, then he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there. So initially he came into Jerusalem on Sunday morning, riding on the donkey, and I don't know whether he rode it out or not, but at any rate, at the end of the day, he left and went back to Bethany, where he had been with Lazarus and his family, to spend the night. And on the next day, of course, he makes his return, but that will be on Monday. And it would probably end up with Monday and Tuesday together for the events that took place during that time. But all of the events that take place during this week are ones that are destined to alienate him as far as the hierarchy of the Jewish system is concerned. So we need to keep in mind the fact that the synagogue was the main thing as far as small Jewish communities were concerned. This was where you got your information, this was where law and order was maintained, and this is where your religious system operated from. The Sanhedrin and its smaller Sanhedrins were ones that supplied the rules and regulations. And part of the problem that had arisen was in the synagogues, they used the verbal Torah, which was the traditions that had been developed. Whereas in the temple, the scribes were there, and they were the legalists, and they were the experts in the Torah itself. So you have a bit of a conflict that exists in the Jewish system between what went on locally and what went on, you might say, nationally. So there's some conflict that exists there too. And Jesus coming as a prophet from one of the outlying areas, he would have probably been looked on as a liberal, among other things, and by the ones that were more tight into it. And if you recall a number of instances, and we'll get to some of those, where Jesus was in conflict with the authorities because he permitted the apostles to do things that they considered outside the law. So we'll take a look at that. So Jesus spent his last week, the beginning of it, in the process of fulfilling prophecies that had been made about him. So hopefully you have learned something that you didn't know about the last week of Jesus and the things that took place during that time. Now I recognize this is not a normal type sermon where we're evangelizing as such, but it's more of a history lesson than anything else. But you just have to accept some things from me because I love history. But we want to, at this time, we want to offer the invitation in the event you need the prayers of the church on your behalf, or we can assist you in your obedience to the gospel. We want you to have your opportunity to let that be known, to come while we stand and while we sing. I hear